Chicago, 1981. An aging public school building perched at the edge of the near north side, its brick facade chipped from decades of wind and industrial haze, its windows tall and dusty, letting in shafts of light that catch drifting chalk particles and motes of plaster. The corridors echo with worn floorboards, squeaking doors, the low hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. The cleaning closets still smell of linseed oil and wax polish. Every morning, George Harris pushes his mop cart along the same route, from Classroom 101, past the stairwell to the second floor, down the hallway with lockers, through the lunchroom and back. His jacket is faded denim, sleeves fraying, pockets patched. Teachers say hello barely, nod toward the chalkboard and walk by. Students, young and restless, call him the floor guy. At best a fixture, at worst an afterthought in stained shoes. George carries silence with him like a second skin. He moves swiftly and quietly, so the floors shine, so no one notices the scuffs, but never so brightly that attention is drawn. At lunchtime he eats alone in the basement janitor's break room. The only light, a single bulb swinging overhead. The only sound, the drip of the faucet and his breathing. Then, one autumn day, when the leaves outside are turning copper and gold, David Miller arrives, a sophomore who transferred in midterm. He's curious, notebook in hand, always lingering behind, always asking questions. He sees things many don't, the way George wipes the blackboard edges, the way teachers glance toward his shadow before moving on, the way students hurry past without seeing. It happens in room 212, a room long closed for repairs. David is helping Mrs. Carter clean up broken plaster, opening cabinets for extra supplies. In a locked drawer under a dusty stack of file folders, he finds it. An old medal. He lifts it into dim light. It is battered, nicked, the ribbon is frayed, the engraving faint. Valor, 1944. Around its edge, a faint emblem of a phoenix rising. David's heart twists. He wonders, what war, what name, what story lies behind this? When he shows it to George, the custodian freezes, the medal clutched in hand. George's eyes go distant, flicker like flames caught in water. There is a pause so long David can hear his own pulse. Then George whispers, "It was given to me long ago, for things you may not believe I did." His voice is thin, fragile, and carries the weight of many unspoken years. David's mind spins with questions. How many lives pass through these halls? How many stories hidden behind the walls? How many silent souls swept under the floorboards? He resolves, this one story must be told. He begins to visit the public library after school, flip through yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs of soldiers, of resistance fighters in Europe, vintage war bonds, community records. He sketches George's face beside pictures of unknown heroes. He writes down everything he learns, names, places, dates. George cleans the hallway unaware at first, just another day. But something shifts. David's searching presence changes the way things are seen. A neighbor remembers having known George's father during wartime. A former teacher, now elderly, recalls hearing whispers of a man who carried letters across enemy lines, who hid refugees in his small apartment. Little clues, almost lost, begin to form a pattern. David does something risky. He saves the medal, cleans it gently, writes a short note, not forgotten, and he hides it carefully in his backpack, determined to build what George never could. Acknowledgement, because sometimes it takes just one student to light a candle in a dark room. Sometimes it takes just one person to see. If this story stirs something, this idea that heroes may walk among us unseen, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to hear stories that once slept in silence. Turn on notifications, because no story like George's should ever fade into the shadows. David Miller carries the medal in his palm, its edges cold, the metal marred by time and wear. In the afternoon light that filters through the high windows of the school's supply closet, the medal glints faintly, the engraving just visible. Valor, 1944. Words coated in rust, ribbon frayed, insignia of a phoenix rising. David draws his breath in, his fingers trembling. "What's this?" he asks. George Harris's face tightens, lines of age and burden sharpen, his eyes cloud over with shadows of memories he thought buried. He pauses, then shakes his head, voice low. "I was awarded this, long ago, but it's not something I want." His hesitation rings like a bell. After class, David sits in the library, the smell of old books and polished wood in his nose. He flips through microfiche reels of wartime newspapers, small print, grainy photos of soldiers, leaflets dropped from planes over occupied territories, stories of underground resistance groups, of couriers, of men risking everything to carry messages in the dark. He sees names he's never heard, small towns in Europe, quiet villages in France, Poland, Netherlands. He sees letters to the editor, opt pieces about veterans who came home but were forgotten. He draws parallels between what he reads and George's actions, the way he moves through the hallways, the way teachers barely speak to him, the way no one seems to notice anything about him except the floor. He turns archival photos of Allied resistance fighters, a young man in a trench coat under an awning, hands clasped, reporting for duty, a woman distributing messages tucked in coat linings, civilians hiding people in barns, in squeezed attics. He photocopies black and white pictures, carries them home, spreads them on his desk alongside his own notes. One photo catches him. A weary young man, uniform faded, clutching a folded letter, standing next to a truck. The caption, "Courier, Resistance Group, Northern France, 1943. The face, jaw stern, eyes determined, seems eerily familiar in posture to George's. David wonders if families abroad preserved such photos, if someone back home still knows. He searches in city archives, public records, war bond drives, veterans registries, military honor rolls. He finds that many men and women who served unofficially, couriers, spies, helpers of resistance movements, are not listed. Official honors often went only to those who fought in uniform under recognized commands, those who acted quietly outside command structures, often invisible. He learns also how many war medals were never claimed after the war, left in boxes, forgotten. One name Ferrone, bravery without applause. One chilled autumn evening, David takes the medal home. He cleans it gently with a soft cloth, careful not to damage the engraving. Under the lamp, he traces the letters with his finger, reads "Valor" until he knows it by heart. He places the medal beside his notebook where he's written, "Not forgotten." He writes down every possibility, what George might have done, where, who he possibly saved, who knew, who remained silent. He asks questions in school. A retired history teacher, Mr. Woodley, remembers stories from his own grandparents about people who smuggled letters across enemy lines during World War II, people who came to Chicago with medals no one asked about. David shows him the medal, asks, "Could someone here have been part of something like this and just kept going?" Mr. Woodley's face is calm, but his eyes flicker, recognition, understanding. David learns that some families in neighborhoods on the South Side spoke in hushed tones of a man who walked too lightly, of someone who worked ordinary jobs but spoke seldom, who avoided attention. David also visits the public library's local history room. He pores over wartime diaries donated by refugees and immigrants. He finds a journal written in broken English by a man who writes about hiding letters in bread loaves and passing messages across borders. He finds another entry. "I kept the medal under my bed. I could not show it. Too dangerous to speak." David wonders, what if that man is George? What if the medal is proof of a life not just lived, but sacrificed, in small ways nobody ever saw? Back in school, nights are long. David lies awake, imagining George during the war, sneaking through moonlit streets, avoiding patrols, delivering messages to people he'd never meet. The image of George as custodian becomes layered, mop and broom by day, messenger of courage by night. The quiet work, the cleaning of floors, the aligning of desks. They seem almost symbolic. Cleaning away dust, sweeping away oblivion. Eventually, David confronts George gently. He shows him the copies of photos, the diary entries, the testimonials from elderly neighbors. He says, "Your story deserves to be seen. I believe you weren't just the floor guy. You were something more." George's hands shake. Tears, old and unwiped, surface in his eyes. He wants to argue, to deny, to silence again, but inside him something shifts. David doesn't demand the full truth. He asks for fragments, stories in pieces. George tells of nights in 1943 when resistance needed couriers, of helping hiding refugees, of passing coded messages written on thin paper, of friends lost, of the weight of silence afterward. In those weeks, the school library becomes David's workshop of memory. He pins photos and documents on boards, writes down what he knows, what he suspects. He consults immigration records, veteran associations. He understands. Recognition is not just about medals and ceremonies, but about reclaiming identity, restoring dignity. At the end of this section, David holds the medal again, its edges polished, its engraving clearer. Valor, 1944. He looks at George in the empty hallway. George's silhouette lingers by the stairwell. David steps forward, the medal extended in his hand, hope trembling. Let people know. George Harris was born in 1920 in a small town in Ohio, where factory smoke curled over rooftops and community gatherings meant hidden conversations. He was only a teenager when war broke out in Europe, when letters from relatives overseas arrived, folded with accents of fear and hope. He learned early that words have power, the power to comfort, to betray, to carry secrets. When the war stirred, he felt compelled, not because of fame, but because someone had to move quietly. In 1942, George joined a small resistance cell that operated out of a basement in a city occupied by enemies overseas. A network of couriers, safe housekeepers, people who risked their lives delivering messages under false names. George carried packages sewn into jackets, letters hidden between book pages, whispers in alleyways. At night, under moonlight, he would bike across fields, avoiding patrols, his heart thudding with fear, his mind fixed on faces of strangers he might never see again. Once he helped guide a family to safety across a border, forging documents, ducking into barns, following stars. Once he was almost caught. He heard boots on wood, saw torches flicker through trees, smelled gunpowder, ducked into a ditch mud-cold, trembling until voices passed above him. He escaped, but not without loss. In spring 1944, George was arrested. It was a betrayal. Someone trusted slipped. Someone gave in to fear. He was interrogated in a cell with no windows. The ceiling dripped, the air heavy with damp and regret. Questions shouted, threats made, beatings in the early hours, aching bones, days indistinguishable from nights. They asked who he worked for, where he stored messages, names of people he knew. He answered little. He lied when he had to. Pain increased, hope nearly died, but he survived. After weeks, they released him, not cleared, but left to fade. Perhaps they thought him less important, or thought silence would purchase his freedom. After the war ended, Europe lay in ruins. George returned to the United States, a young man with hollow eyes and medals unsought. He tried to speak of what he had seen, the hunger, the death, the betrayal, but people listened briefly, then changed the subject. His parents nodded, but faltered. Neighbors called him quiet or reserved. The Valor Medal awarded by a resistance council in Europe came in the mail. A ribbon, a certificate in a foreign language. He touched it, stared at it, then locked it away in a box. He didn't want pity. He didn't want attention. He wanted to forget, to rebuild. During the 1950s and 60s, America entered new wars. The Cold War grew. Anti-communist sentiment, suspicion, loyalty oaths. George worked many jobs, mechanic's assistant, factory line, then eventually moved to Chicago and took a custodial position at a public school. He found solace in the routine, mopping floors, cleaning chalkboards, fixing broken doorknobs. In those repetitive chores, there was something soothing, a way to smooth out edges of memory, to let the past fade bit by bit into dust and polish. Yet the memories never fully receded. At night, in his small apartment above a laundromat, his dreams played again, the crackle of gunfire, people screaming, names whispered in darkness. He woke, gasping. The medal under his bed felt like a weight. It shone softly in the darkness, a reminder that bravery had touched him, that fear had shaped him, that choices made in shadows matter. But the world around him had no room for those shadows. They preferred clean lines of heroism, clear narratives. George's story was messy, grey. As years passed, he avoided conversations about his service. When fellow veterans talked about parades, about uniforms, about medals, he changed the subject. When neighbors asked what he did during the war, he said, "Nothing much, just what anyone might do." He came to believe that invisibility was safest, that if he strove to be seen, he might be judged, misunderstood, or worse, that his help might be dismissed, labeled unofficial, too small, inconvenient. He watched history books attribute valor to generals and official heroes. Newspapers published stories of widely recognized figures. Resistance efforts that didn't conform to formal military structure felt omitted. George often thought of those who stayed behind in Europe, families lost, friends who never returned, messages that didn't reach, people waiting in basements, starving, hoping. He carried guilt, survivor's guilt, guilt of silence, even as he dusted gym floors, mopped cafeteria tiles, wiped chalkboards that no one thanked him for. The silence became a companion. Decades passed. George aged, his body stooped slightly, his hands rough and marked by cleaning chemicals and scrapes from broken floor tiles. He adjusted lights, emptied trash bins, fixed leaky faucets. Children ran past, shouting, laughing, unaware. Teachers greeted him with politeness. No one ever asked about the medal. He never showed it. He never invited questions. Shadows of his past remained locked away. The resistance cells address, names of people he helped, the fear of betrayal, the cost of speaking. Though the world changed around him, civil rights movements, social upheavals, changes in public memory of the war, George stayed in his quiet corner. He believed that some stories were too painful to share, better to let them rest than stir old wounds. He feared messing up narratives. He feared tarnishing memories if misremembered. So the medal stayed hidden, tucked in a drawer of his small desk in the boiler room, covered with dust, unseen, but always there. But there were signs. The way sometimes a student dropped their books and George helped without being asked. The way a teacher once paused while sweeping up broken chalk, glanced at his hands. The way a local newspaper once wrote about custodial workers and unsung heroes in a community column. And George read it alone, his heart warm and aching at once. These moments built up inside him, whispers of possibility that perhaps someone would care, perhaps someone would see. In silence there is strength, but also weight. In doing nothing, he preserved a story. In speaking, he risked losing something. And yet the years of struggle, the wartime danger, the post-war invisibility, all led to this delicate point, when a student's curiosity could break decades of hidden fear. At the end of this section, George stands in his apartment one evening holding the medal, feeling its weight, tracing its edges. He thinks, if they knew, would they still see me doing this? Pushing this cart, wiping these boards, sweeping these floors. He imagines the student David calling his name, the school hallways full of quiet nods. He clenches the medal tight, breathing in hope, daring for the first time in many years to believe that his story might matter after all. Weeks pass after David's research at the library, each evening spent poring over archival clippings, diaries, old immigration records, trying to match faces and names. One Saturday, he visits his grandmother's house where the wood floors creak. Scent of old perfume lingers in the hall. Family portraits line the walls. His grandmother, Evelyn Miller, sits in a rocking chair near the fireplace, knitting though her hands shake slightly. David gently places the Medal of Valor on the coffee table between them and asks, "Grandma, When did you first meet George Harris? Evelyn freezes. The knitting drops. She peers at the medal, fingers trembling. She remembers. She was a child during the war, living in a neighborhood full of immigrant families. Her father was a butcher, her mother a seamstress. They had friends from Europe, families who came to Chicago with war stories, letters in broken English, precious mementos tucked in trunks. Evelyn recalls a gathering in 1945 in their small house, candles lit, voices hushed in dark corners. One man came in late, muddy boots, coat stained, carrying documents sewn into his jacket lining. That man was George Harris. She didn't know his name then. Her family whispered about him. He carried letters, someone said, saved someone's life. But then silence came. No one asked more. It was too dangerous or too painful. David listens, heart pounding. He asks Evelyn for any photos, old letters, anything from that time. She brings out a faded photo album, grainy snapshots, children running, a man bending down handing a letter to a young woman, a church basement meeting with refugees. One photograph shows Evelyn's father and George Harris standing together under a lamppost, their faces lit by candle glare, serious eyes, thin lips. The date scribbled on the back, Spring 45. David holds the photo gingerly, recognizing posture, coat collar, hair, all similar to George today. Grandma Evelyn produces a bundle of letters she kept hidden for decades because she thought no one wanted to remember. One is addressed to her father in German, with shaky handwriting, Danke für alles. Ich hoffe, dass eines Tages jemand sieht, was wir getan haben. Thank you for everything. I hope one day someone sees what we did. The writer, she says, was George. She never showed them to anyone beyond her close family for fear of gossip, fear of misunderstanding, fear that curiosity might bring unwanted attention. David feels tears itching, the weight of decades of unspoken truth pressing in. Through those letters, David pieces together that his grandfather had been part of a small local network aiding European resistance fighters after they immigrated to the US, helping them get shelter, helping them send money and messages back. George had corresponded with these networks. It wasn't just that they'd both acted courageously overseas, but that their lives had run in parallel in the quiet lines of family history, helping, hiding, not boasting. David returns to school with renewed purpose. He shares copies of Evelyn's photos with George, gently. A day when George mops late evening, the hallway deserted, quiet except for distant footsteps. David places the photo in George's hand. George stares, mouth slightly open. He stares at himself in that younger form, muddy boots, eyes resolute. The photo falls slightly. George picks it up, his voice a whisper. I didn't expect someone to care this much. For a moment he is not Custodian, not the floor guy, but the young courier, the man who carried letters sewn inside jackets, who believed someone someday would remember. They both go to the archives together, David helping George read faded script, translate German, old dialects, broken phrases. They discover entries in naturalization records, in census data, immigrant registries showing George's name, date of arrival, but nothing about war awards in official US documentation. One certificate George has is in German, awarded by a small resistance council overseas, not recognized in US military records. David scans and digitizes everything. Photos, letters, the certificate, the medal itself. He compiles a timeline of George's life. Born 1920, recruited 1942, captured in 1944, immigration in 1946, years of work, holding the medal in a drawer, silence, and now this moment. David shares his findings in history class. Mrs. Carter, the teacher, is moved. She shows the timeline on the classroom projector. Photos of wartime resistance, George's letters, Evelyn's memories, George himself. The class is silent. Students lean forward, some with tears, some with respect. They ask questions. Why didn't George tell sooner? Was he afraid of disbelief? George answers softly, I meant no harm by hiding. I thought no one would understand, or that talking would reopen old wounds. David sees his face. Lined, worn, but eyes full of relief, as though invisibility has lifted a bit. They plan a tribute. A small committee of students, teachers, David and Evelyn meets after school. They design posters, "The Quiet Courage of George Harris, Valor, Not Vanity." They collect letters of support from local veterans groups, from immigrant families who recognized parts of their own stories echoed in George's. They prepare a display for the school library, photos, letters, the medal in a glass case, the certificate, a plaque explaining what Valor 1944 meant in a resistance cell overseas. Grandma Evelyn provides more items. A handmade scarf that George once sent her mother, stitched with small symbols. A journal entry about a winter night when George helped smuggle refugees into hiding under a harsh snow. A worn map with marked safe routes, the edges frayed, folded many times. Each item brings stories, faces, names once forgotten. David arranges them carefully. First the pleas for help, then the captured moments, then the silence, then this emerging light of recognition. At the end of this section one afternoon, David leads George to the library display, the cases lit by soft lamps, the ribbon of the medal poised under glass, photographs lined above it. George stands, surrounded by students, teachers, Evelyn. He sees his younger self in the photo, the letters that bear his handwriting, the words carved in German and English. A student reads aloud his own letter, "Thank you for preserving truth." And George allows himself, for the first time in decades, to believe, maybe I mattered, maybe this story can help others see their own. The morning is grey but full of electricity. George Harris wheeling his mop cart through the hallway, corridor tiles worn smooth, lockers lining both sides in muted pastel hues of faded greens and greys. The air smells of cleaning solution and damp concrete, the echo of shoes, distant chatter. He pauses at the entrance to the auditorium, pushes open the double doors gently, expecting the usual emptiness, the chairs stacked, lights dim. But something is different. The room is filled. The students are arranged in aisles, teachers flanking the walls, parents in folding chairs at the back. A soft hush. It's not assembly day. The principal, Ms. Caldwell, her face serious, stands at the podium. Spotlights dimmed but warm bulbs along the edges, casting amber glows. On the front wall hangs a large framed photo. George in uniform, young and determined, standing upright against rubble and wire, an image neither the school nor most people had seen. Next to it, under glass, the medal, mounted on a velvet backing. The ribbon, though fragile, still catches light. A certificate in a simple frame, calligraphy style, reads, "To our true guardian." George stands in the doorway, cart stopped, broom propped, heart pounding. His breath catches. He's being watched not as the floor guy, not as a shadow of corridors, but as someone honored. He walks forward slowly, each step echoing in the silent auditorium. Students bow their heads, hands folded. Teachers stand, some with hands clasped, others with tears unstirred but glimmering in eyes. Evelyn, David's grandmother, sits in the front row, her hands in her lap, knuckles white, watching. Ms. Caldwell clears her throat. "Today we gather not to celebrate someone new, but to reveal what has always been here. George Harris has walked quietly among us, pushing his cart, mopping our floors, polishing our stages. He has erased scuff marks, fixed broken hinges, cleaned chalk dust, but he has also carried stories no one asked him to tell, borne memories unseen." She gestures, and David steps forward. He holds George's medal gently in both hands, lifts it carefully for all to see. "This medal says Valor 1944, David continues, voice steady though emotion quivers. "But it is more than a word and a date. It is proof that courage is sometimes invisible." George didn't fight for recognition. He fought so others could be safe, so letters could reach homes, so families separated by war would hear whispers of hope. George's voice emerges, soft, cracked. "Thank you for seeing me," he says. Tears roll down his cheeks, thin tracks, old grief mixing with relief. He touches the medal, fingers trembling. The auditorium stills, A student near the front whispers, "He really did it." Then the applause begins, quiet, respectful, swelling. It is not triumphalism, it is acknowledgement, long overdue, tender. It speaks of forgiveness, of memory restored. The photo on the wall shows George, young, mud-splattered, strong. Next to it, letters from Evelyn, photographs of refugees sheltered, maps used, safe houses hidden behind barns and basements. The display glows under low lights. Posters in the background read, "Stories unforgotten, quiet heroes among us, the courage to remember." Someone from the Veterans Association, invited as guest, hands George a certificate, handwritten, wood-framed, for unwavering courage, compassion beyond self, and the invisible battles waged so others may live. He accepts it with bowed head. He looks at each person in the auditorium, students, teachers, his neighbor who always greeted him in the hallway, the woman in the office who once saw him clean a fallen flower in a vase, the janitor from years past who saw him at his worst, none aware of his past. George steps to the lectern. His hands shake. He clears his throat. "I never wanted this," he says, voice low but firm. "I hid because I believed no one would hear. I feared I was a burden rather than a witness. But today, I see you listened. You saw me, not just the work I do, but the life I carried." He pauses, looks to David, to Evelyn. "I hope this moment doesn't close like a book, but opens a page so others don't have to stay unseen." "Lucas?" "No, David." His name echoes quietly. David steps back, swelling pride in his chest. The audience leans in, silence again as George leaves the stage. Students approach later, quiet hugs, hands on shoulder. "Thank you, you deserve this. I'm sorry I never asked." Teachers pull out tissues. Some parents weep softly. Outside, the courtyard is cold, concrete benches dusted with frost. George walks through the students, cleaners replaced by clasped hands, whispers in his ear, "I saw, I remember, thank you." The medal in its case is displayed in the library foyer, glass lit, people passing it in quiet reverence. A plaque set beside it reads, "George Harris. Custodian, courier, courage in silence." Days later, the hallways change. The echo of mops is no longer just the sound of cleaning. It becomes cadence of respect. Students now greet him, "Morning, Mr. Harris." Teachers nod, "Thank you for all you've done." In class, history lessons include George's story in units about W2, the resistance, immigrant contributions, heroes unrecognized. The recognition doesn't erase scars. George still recalls nights in prison, the betrayal, the cold cells. The memories still visit him, nightmares, flashbacks, guilt, but these are balanced now by warmth. His life, once hidden, now participates in collective memory. His medal no longer locked in a drawer but in glass, seen by many. As the sun sets one evening, light through library windows casts long patterns on the floor. Students read letters in the display. A young girl traces the medal's engraving with a finger. Valor, 1944. David watches from a distance with Evelyn, hand on her shoulder. George enters silently behind them, sees them, smiles, a small, fragile smile. It is enough. George Harris returns to his custodial duties the next morning, but the corridors feel different now. When he pushes his mop through the hallway, the reflection in the polished tile is no longer just shapes, it's faces, students pausing to nod, a teacher pausing in the doorway to say, "Good morning, George," not just the custodian. He still smells of cleaning wax, still hears the squeak of floorboards, still sees the chalk dust drift in the sunlight, but there's a warmth behind his eyes, a small, fragile light that years of silence never extinguished. In the school library behind glass sits the medal, Valor 1944. Under it, the certificate. Nearby, the letters, the photograph of the young man in uniform, the map folded many times. A plaque tells the story. George's wartime efforts, his long post-war silence, his courage that no one saw until now. Students walk by, reading aloud quietly, "In memory of invisible battles. Thank you for the courage to live quietly. Some touch the glass, some close their eyes, few smile. And each time, George knows, some part of him has been acknowledged, some part of his life has taken root in memory. David Miller continues his writing, now in school newsletter columns, city newspapers, even a local radio show. He talks about the value not just of big heroics, but of small acts, hidden sacrifices. He asks interviewers, how many people walk past heroes every day without knowing? And he presses for voices often unheard, immigrants, resistance fighters, women who sheltered others in silence. Because George's story shows that silence is heavy, but acknowledgement lightens it. George doesn't forget the nights when he was afraid, the betrayal, the weight of carrying secrets. He doesn't forget the people who didn't survive, the names he never spoke. Memory is not tidy. It returns in dreams, in small tremors, in refusal of forgetting. But now Frederick, the school librarian, or Mrs. Carter, the history teacher, or students who used to hurry past his cart, they see him, they ask questions, they listen, and that listening becomes part of the healing. In his small apartment, George takes out the box where he hid the medal all those years. He opens it, touches the fabric of the ribbon, feels its cold edge. He places it properly on a shelf, no longer hidden under floorboards or desk drawers, but where it can be looked at, thought of, honored. He sits by the narrow window late afternoon, sunlight fading, and lets the silence hold him differently. Not as regret, but as peace. The school year moves on. Assemblies reference George's story. History classes include discussion not only of famous battles, but of stations of silence. Those individuals who acted where no one was watching. Those who helped when speaking was dangerous. Those whose lives were marked not by applause, but by constant, quiet courage. The students, when asked to write about what heroism means, often write about George. Not necessarily what he did in 1944, but what it cost him to carry it for decades, and what it cost the community not to notice. George walks through hallways now with lifted shoulders. He pushes the cart, not seeking attention but accepting it. He smiles when someone says, "Thanks." His reflection in the floors and windows becomes a testimony. Yes, I existed. I acted. I matter. What began with curiosity in a locked drawer, with a student's refusal to ignore, blossoms into something larger. The recognition that every life holds untold stories. Every silence may conceal a hero. Every overlooked person might just be the keeper of memory. Because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that changes history. It's the one who dares to be seen after being unseen. If George's journey moved you, if you believe the quietest acts deserve recognition, then please like this video. Share this story with friends and family who might need to see heroes in unexpected places. Subscribe and turn on notifications so we can bring more stories of hidden courage to light, and so no one who lived bravery in silence ever fades into forgetfulness.